The statement was filed as a hunting incident, not as a confession, and not as a piece of folklore. It sits among the practical papers of 1875, the sort of year that was recorded in receipts and weather notes rather than in stories. In that region, the forests were not scenery. They were food, leather, tallow, and barter. A failed hunt was not merely disappointing, it was arithmetic. It meant less salted meat before winter, fewer hides to trade, less powder bought back from town. That is the environment that produced the document, and it explains its voice. The men who dictated it did not sound like men trying to be believed. They sounded like men trying to be accurate. It begins the way many such reports begin, with the route taken, the time of day, and the reason for being out. There is mention of a late thaw and of the river running high, of the week's plan to work the ridges where red deer usually crossed. Names appear only in the way they do in official notes, as witnesses to a decision. What matters is how the narrator, who is not identified by the clerk, frames the problem. They did not write that the forest was haunted. They wrote that the hunt was failing in a way that did not match the season. They wrote that game moved incorrectly, that trails ended where they should not, and that men who had hunted the same ground for years began to return with their powders still dry. The tone remains disciplined even when it moves into what the clerk later underlined, likely because it was the first time the statement included something that did not belong to the usual language of hunting. The narrator describes the discovery of animal remains that did not fit a wolf or a bear. He notes the absence of tracks where tracks should have been and mentions that the carcasses looked handled rather than fed upon. He does not call it magic. He does not call it evil. He calls it interference. The word appears more than once, as though that were the only category available to him. Something had come into their work and altered the results. Near the end of the recorded statement, there is a brief exchange rendered almost word for word. The clerk wrote it down as dialogue, not because it was dramatic, but perhaps because it contained the only term in the entire report that sounded old. An older hunter, asked what might cause such signs, answered with a word he did not volunteer until pressed: strigoi. The clerk spelled it the way it was spoken. No explanation follows. The report does not attach legends or prayers. It returns to practicalities. It lists the decision to withdraw from the upper ground, to hunt nearer the open fields, to avoid certain stands of timber until conditions improved. Then it ends as if that were sufficient. What makes the statement last is not that it claims a monster, but that it reads like a man describing a tool that no longer worked as expected. It has the plainness of someone speaking to officials who will not be impressed by superstition and will not compensate anyone for fear. It asks for no remedy. It requests no patrol. It only records what happened and why the usual explanation failed. The clerk filed it under hunting loss and moved on. Only later, when other notes accumulated in the same hand, did it become clear that the paper was not the beginning of a story, but the first surviving trace of a change in routine, one that could be measured by the simple fact that skilled men began to come home empty. To understand why that word mattered at all, it helps to understand how the men lived before they ever spoke it. The hunters in that region were not wanderers. They were tradesmen of a kind, trained by necessity and by repetition. Their schedules followed patterns as strict as any shop. They rose before light, checked lines and traps, read the wind, and moved in pairs or threes depending on the ground. They carried what worked: a knife that had been sharpened by the same hand for years, a coil of cord, a small tin of fat for fires that had to catch in wet weather, powder kept dry inside oiled cloth. Their language was mostly about signs. A broken twig at a certain height, a patch of bark rubbed smooth, droppings fresh enough to still shine. A print that told you whether the animal was walking, trotting, or spooked. The land taught them what to fear in a direct way. Weather could kill a man quietly. A fog could erase distance and direction. A twisted ankle 5 miles from shelter could become a slow emergency. Wolves were not a myth to them. Bears were not symbols. They were bodies with weight and appetite and habits that could be learned. The hunters knew where predators denned, which valleys carried sound, how long a carcass would last before it drew scavengers. They did not romanticize the work. They butchered where they had to. They slept near their own blood. They could travel at night if the moon was good and the terrain was familiar. They did not like it, but it did not unmake them. There is a particular calm that comes from this kind of competence. It is not bravery in the theatrical sense. It is a confidence built from having been wrong before and surviving the correction. When a man like that says he is unsure, it carries more weight than when a fearful man insists he is certain. That is part of what gives the 1875 statements their texture. These were not people who needed a monster to explain inconvenience. They already had explanations for most things. A hard winter pushed the deer lower. Too much hunting in one valley thinned the numbers. A change in wind made scenting easier for prey. If wolves were active, you would find signs of them, and you would adjust. Hunting was a conversation with the land in which you expected the land to answer predictably. Blood itself was not a shock to them, which matters because later details can only be understood against that baseline. When they found a carcass, they did not recoil. They assessed it. What kind of kill? How old? What had fed? How far it might have been dragged? They had seen animals opened by predators in ways that were messy and urgent, and they understood the logic of it. Predators tear because they must. They bite where the hide is thinnest. They feed first on organs. They leave scatter and sign. Even when a kill was strange, it was strange within a familiar grammar. The same was true of night noises. The forest spoke at night in creaks, in distant calls, in the occasional crash of something large moving through brush. Hunters could tell what belonged and what did not by rhythm alone. A deer bolting has a certain panic to it. A boar has weight and impatience. A wolf pack makes sound with intention. These men listened the way sailors listen to their ship. It was their safety. So when the trouble began, it did not arrive as terror. It arrived as incorrectness. A quiet mismatch between expectation and result. It was the kind of thing that makes experienced men check their own senses first. They began by assuming error. They repeated routes, verified sign, blamed their timing, even blamed each other's patience. But the pattern persisted, and the persistence is what pushed the situation from ordinary difficulty into something that felt, to them, like an intrusion. By the time the first statement was recorded, their routines were still mostly intact, but the certainty beneath them had started to thin. They were still rising early, still cutting tracks, still setting up as they had for years. Yet increasingly the work ended the same way. They would reach a place that should have held life and find it empty. Or they would find evidence of life that ended abruptly as if the animal had stopped existing at the moment it became aware of something else. That was the first fracture, and it did not feel like fear at first. It felt like the land had stopped speaking honestly. The early signs were subtle enough that a less practiced eye might have missed them. It began with the prey. Deer that should have lingered in sheltered gullies were moving earlier and higher than expected, as if driven. Rabbits bolted from cover without the usual trigger of scent or noise. Birds lifted in uneven bursts, not as a flock reacting to a hawk, but in scattered panic like individuals startled by something too close to see. A hunter can accept bad luck, but the animals behaved as though luck had changed shape. They also began finding tracks that ended. Not in the way tracks end when ground turns to stone or to hard-packed ice, but in soil that should have held the mark clearly. A line of prints would lead into a stand of trees and then stop, as if the animal had been lifted or had chosen to leave the earth. They circled those places, widening the search, expecting to pick up the trail where it turned. Often they did not. When they did pick it up again, it was sometimes at an angle that made no sense, as though the animal had fled without following terrain, without choosing the easiest line. It was the sort of movement you see when an animal is no longer thinking about food or fatigue, only about distance. Feeding sites were abandoned mid-use. Hunters found bark stripped in fresh curls, then nothing, as if the deer had stopped chewing and run. They found spots where wild pigs had rooted up the soil, then left in a rush, leaving their usual mess unfinished. Even the scat changed. In places where droppings were usually scattered along a route, they would find them concentrated in one anxious patch, as if the animals had stood together for a time and then dispersed suddenly. Hunters read those things the way others read letters. The content was clear even if the cause was not. Something had been near them, close enough to push them out of ordinary behavior. It is important that, at this stage, there was still no direct sighting. There was only the sense of arriving second, always arriving after something else had already passed through and disturbed what should have been stable. Hunters sometimes describe a place as feeling used, meaning not by man but by animal presence. A valley can feel used by deer the way a trail feels used by carts. In 1875, some of those valleys began to feel used in a different way. Not lived in, but visited, pressed upon. The air carried a kind of emptied attention. Fires seemed to draw less sound back from the trees. When men paused, the forest did not settle. It held itself. One detail repeats across accounts from different men. They describe silence, but not the ordinary quiet of snow or windless dusk. They describe a silence that followed them. When they stopped walking, the forest did not resume its small movements. Insects did not return. Birds did not test a call. It was as if the place had already decided to keep still. And when the hunters began to move again, the normal noises would follow at a delay, cautious, like a room resuming breath after someone leaves. The men responded in the practical way first. They adjusted. They changed routes, took longer loops, hunted closer to open ground. They spent more time verifying wind and less time trusting old patterns. They became more careful with scent, more disciplined about how they crossed ridges. At first, these changes were framed as improvements, the way a man tightens his method when the season is uncooperative. But as the weeks passed, the changes took on a different character. They were no longer aimed at finding game. They were aimed at avoiding something that was not named. What made the unease spread was that it did not belong to one man's imagination. The same signs appeared across different lines, on different days, under different weather. When the hunters met at the edge of the woods or in town to trade and resupply, they began to notice that others were coming back with the same tightness in their faces, the same short talk, the same tendency to look at the tree line as if expecting to see a familiar shape and finding only the dark. They did not sit together and decide to be afraid. There was no meeting, no vote. The agreement formed the way weather forms gradually until you realize everyone has pulled their coat tighter without speaking. A hunter would choose a different valley than usual and later learn another man had done the same. Someone would return early with an excuse about wind or light, and the excuse would be accepted too quickly because it matched what others had already felt but not said. The ordinary competitive talk of hunters, the small boasting and correction, dulled noticeably. Men became less interested in proving they could take more, go farther, stay out longer. Small behaviors changed first. Fires were kept lower, not because of scarcity of fuel, but because tall flame feels like a signal. Camps were placed closer to open ground, where the line of sight was longer. Watches extended, not out of discipline, but out of the inability to sleep deeply. When men spoke at night, they kept their voices flat and brief. There is a certain kind of conversation that happens around camp when work has been good, the loose, tired talk that fills the dark. That talk disappeared. Instead, there was silence punctuated by practical questions. How much powder left? Which direction the wind shifted? Whether anyone heard something move beyond the first stand of trees? Most telling was how they treated certain areas of the forest. Places are not simply coordinates to hunters. They are remembered by events. A ridge where a man once slipped and broke his rifle stock. A creek where a bear came down unexpectedly. A grove where the deer always crossed late in the year. In 1875, some of those places became unsaid. Men began referring to them indirectly or not at all. They did not tell new boys, the younger men, why they were avoiding them. They simply moved the work elsewhere and let the omission stand as instruction. The corroboration was quiet but thick. Hunter reported a set of tracks that ended in soft ground. Another, days later, described finding the same kind of abrupt emptiness near a different creek. A third mentioned that the wolves had gone silent in a valley that usually carried their calls. The important part is that no one concluded anything aloud. They merely accumulated the same observations and adjusted their behavior accordingly. When the same kind of wrongness repeats across men who do not share the same fears, it begins to behave like fact, and yet even then they resisted naming it. Names are dangerous in practical communities because they change what you are allowed to do. If you call it wolves, you can organize. If you call it a man, you can hunt him. If you call it weather, you can wait. But if you call it something older and less specific, you admit you do not know what action is appropriate. That admission is not easy for people whose lives depend on correct decisions. The silence also had a social function. In those villages, being labeled superstitious could make a man less employable. It could make others doubt his judgment. So the men protected themselves by speaking in the language of work. They said the ground was poor. They said the game had moved. They blamed the season. They blamed themselves. But their bodies told the truth. They slept with their knives within reach. They kept their rifles closer even when not expecting predators. They held their gaze on the edges of camp longer than necessary. It was not only fear that created the agreement, it was recognition. Hunters can sense when another hunter has seen something that has rearranged him. It shows in the way he walks, as if he is listening with his whole torso, in the way he stops too often to check behind him without fully turning, in the way he refuses to speak about what he saw, but cannot stop behaving as though it is near. That recognition moved through the group like an unspoken signal. And once it moved, it became difficult for any one man to pretend he was untouched. By late spring, the pattern was established. They avoided certain timber. They ended hunts earlier. They traveled in closer formation. They did not say why. The report filed in 1875 reads calm because the men were still trying to keep the matter inside the boundaries of ordinary hunting difficulty. But beneath that calm there was a shared pressure, and it was building toward the moment when avoidance would no longer be enough, and someone would finally say the word because all other language had failed. The word did not appear in the hunting reports at first. It came out in the spaces between work, in the way older men sometimes speak when they believe the day is nearly done and there is nothing to gain by pretending. One account describes it being said in a low voice while cleaning a rifle, as if it were another tool or condition. Another says it was spoken only after a younger man laughed and called the fear childish, prompting an older hunter to look at him for a long time before answering. Strigoi was not offered as a story. It was offered as a label for a kind of problem. The older men described it in functional terms, with an emphasis on what it did rather than what it was. They did not talk about curses or graves. They talked about being watched. They talked about animals that stop behaving like animals because something is near. They talked about bodies that look used rather than eaten. They spoke with the tight economy of men who do not want to decorate what cannot be fixed. In some versions, the older hunters refused to elaborate. They said only that if the word fit, then the right response was distance. Not confrontation, not tracking, not proving anything. Distance. One man is recorded as saying, "It is not for killing," which in that culture meant it was not a thing you could take with skill and pride. Another said, "If it is there, you do not make it familiar with you." The advice came out like inherited discipline, as though it had been passed down without ever being written. The younger men asked, naturally, what it looked like. The answers were inconsistent, and that inconsistency is part of what kept the subject from becoming a shared myth. One described it as pale. Another said thin. Another said it was not the shape that mattered, but the stillness, the way it held itself like a person pretending to be part of the forest. There were also cautions that sounded more like hunting protocol than superstition. Do not whistle at night. Do not call out in the trees. Do not follow a trail that ends too cleanly. Do not take the shortcut through the narrow timber after dusk. What remains consistent is the reluctance. The term was not spoken as entertainment. It was spoken as if it carried consequences. Older hunters avoided saying it in the open, avoided saying it near the forest edge, avoided saying it at night. Some treated the word as a kind of invitation, not in a magical sense, but in a practical sense. If you name something, you begin to look for it, and if you look for it, you bring your attention to it. Attention, in these accounts, is treated almost like a scent, something that can be noticed. The clerk's later notes suggest he had heard the term before because he did not ask for spelling. He wrote it down quickly and moved on. That too is telling. It implies a local familiarity, the sort that exists without requiring belief. People can know a term the way they know the name for a dangerous bend in the river. You do not need to believe the river is malicious to respect the bend. After the word was spoken, it did not bring relief. It did not resolve the uncertainty. In some ways, it tightened it. The men now had a label that carried a history of avoidance. It changed the emotional weather. They began to measure the forest differently, not as a place that might contain predators, but as a place that might contain something that does not act like a predator at all. Wolves hunt, bears defend, men trespass. Those are motives you can anticipate. The strigoi, as the older hunters used the word, was defined by the absence of an ordinary motive. It did not need to rush. It did not need to leave sign. It did not need to feed in the way animals feed. In the weeks that followed, the hunters did what people do when they feel a threat they cannot frame. They tried to reduce the variables. They stayed closer together. They stayed closer to daylight. They stayed closer to places where they could see. They told themselves that the term was just a word for a set of unusual signs, nothing more. And for a time that was almost sustainable, until the forest provided something that did not fit any category of sign at all, something tangible enough that the men stopped arguing with their own senses. The first carcass described in detail was a roe deer found in a shallow basin where the hunters had expected to find feeding sign. It was not hidden, not dragged into cover as wolves often do, not torn open in the urgent way of a hungry animal. It lay with a strange neatness, limbs folded wrong but not broken, as if it had been placed rather than dropped. The hide was intact in most places. There were marks, but they did not read as clawing or tearing. There was very little blood in the soil. That absence, more than anything, unsettled the men because blood is the honest part of a kill. It stains the story into the ground. Hunter in the statement describes touching the fur and finding it cool but not stiff, suggesting it had died not long before. They searched for tracks, expecting at least the heavy sign of a bear or the narrow line of a wolf pack. They found almost nothing. No churned soil, no scattered debris. Just the deer, the flattened grass beneath it, and a faint pattern in the nearby dirt that could have been caused by dragging, but did not align with any animal's stride. They circled wider, looking for where the deer might have been chased from. The trail that led to it was short and ended abruptly, as if the animal had stopped running and simply ceased moving at a particular point. The men did not linger long, but long enough to see that the deer had been opened with something that did not behave like teeth. The damage was restrained, precise in an unnerving way. Predators make a mess because they are shaped by urgency. This looked like handling, like work. One hunter said it reminded him of how a man might cut a carcass in the first stage of butchering, but without the practical aim of removing meat. It was as if something had wanted access to the inside without interest in the rest. Later, they found a hare with its neck intact and no obvious crushing, yet the body was slack in a way that suggested emptiness, as if something essential had been taken without the usual violence. Hunters are not physicians, but they know the look of an animal that has bled out, and the look of one that has been torn. This looked like neither. The flesh did not have the swollen bruising of a struggle. There were no signs of a chase, no fur clumps, no smear of blood. It was simply wrong in a quiet way. As the weeks passed, more remains were found. A fox left in the open with no sign of having been eaten by larger predators, as if even scavengers avoided it. A young deer near a creek, with water around it undisturbed, implying it had not collapsed there after running. The men began to mark the locations in their minds and noticed a pattern that tightened their unease. The bodies appeared closer to the places they had begun avoiding, as if whatever was causing them was not scattered randomly, but rooted to certain ground. They also began to notice what was absent. Normally, death in the forest draws life. Insects arrive. Birds test the scene. Smaller scavengers leave their tiny tracks around the edges. Here, the carcasses seemed isolated. The area around them felt held back. One man described finding a deer and realizing that he could not hear anything for several minutes, not even the small wind through leaves. He wrote that his own breathing sounded too loud, which is a detail that appears again and again in later accounts, a sign that the men felt observed, not by sight but by the way sound behaved. Their reaction remained practical. They did not pray over the bodies. They did not attempt rituals. They backed away and left them where they lay. This was not reverence. It was avoidance, a survival instinct that had become specific. They told each other not to touch what they found. They stopped bringing dogs into certain timber because the dogs would refuse to go, or would go and then return with their tails low, not barking, not searching, simply wanting out. Even that detail stayed restrained in the reports. There is no claim of supernatural understanding in the animals, only the observation that trained dogs began to act like untrained ones, unreliable, as if their senses were overwhelmed by something that did not fit their experience. The carcasses were, in a way, the first undeniable contact. Tracks can be misread, silence can be imagined. But a body is a body. A hunter can hold it, lift it, smell it. They had spent their lives in that reality. The bodies told them that something was interfering directly, not only spooking prey, but taking it in a manner that left the forest temporarily empty around the evidence. And once that kind of evidence appears, the next step is almost inevitable. Men who live by reading sign begin to watch for the thing that makes the sign. They begin, even against their own wishes, to look up. The first sighting recorded with any clarity happened at a time of day when the forest is most difficult to judge, the thin hour at the edge of light, when distance compresses and the eye fills in what it cannot fully see. Two men were moving along a ridge line, not deep in timber but close enough that the trees still blocked most of their view downslope. They had already decided to turn back. The day had yielded nothing but disturbed sign, and their patience had shifted into caution. On their return they passed a gap where the trees opened onto a small clearing, a place where they could see farther than usual. One of them noticed motion first, but not the kind you expect. Not a deer breaking cover, not a bird lifting. It was a slow change in the arrangement of pale shapes between trunks. At first he thought it was a birch trunk catching the last light, but it moved against the logic of the wind. He stopped. The other man stopped because he felt the change in the first man's posture, that stiffening that comes when attention locks onto something. They saw, at the far edge of the clearing, a figure upright among the trees. It did not stand like a man working or walking. It stood as if it had been placed there, with an absence of small adjustments. When a person stands in the woods, even trying to be still, there is motion in the shoulders, in the shift of weight. This had none of that. It was simply vertical, pale against darker bark, with limbs held close in a way that made it seem narrower than it should have been. The men did not describe it in grand language. They did not say it had glowing eyes. They did not say it flew. They said it was pale, and that it did not reflect the light the way skin normally does at that distance. They said the head seemed angled slightly, as if listening, and they said that, even before it moved, the clearing felt wrong, as though sound had been reduced. The statement notes that they could hear their own boots on dry leaves too clearly, and that the usual background noise had fallen away. Then it moved, not quickly. That was the detail that stayed with them. It stepped from behind one trunk to another with a deliberation that did not match fear or hunting. An animal moves with economy and urgency. A person moves with purpose. This moved as though purpose were optional. It did not hurry to close distance, and it did not hurry to escape. It simply changed position to keep itself partly behind cover while remaining visible enough to be known. The men realized with a quiet shock that it was not an accidental sighting. It was allowing itself to be seen. Hunter described the movement as too smooth, not in a magical sense but in a physiological sense. The step did not have the sway of a heavy body. The limbs seemed to extend and retract without the normal interruption of muscle effort. Another wrote that it reminded him of seeing a man through water, the proportions slightly wrong, the angles not matching expectation. The face, when briefly visible, was described as flat, not expressive, and too still. Not dead, not asleep, simply absent of the small life signs you subconsciously rely on to place a human being in the world. They did not approach. They did not raise their rifles. This has been questioned by later readers, but it makes sense in the moment. Hunters shoot when they know what they are shooting and when the act promises a result. Here, the act felt like a provocation without a plan. They stood long enough to confirm it was not a trick of light, not a man they knew. Then they began to back away, not running because running announces fear and invites pursuit, but retreating with a controlled pace. They kept their eyes on it longer than was comfortable because turning away felt like surrendering awareness. As they withdrew, the figure did something that chilled them more than any sudden lunge would have. It matched them. Not directly, not charging, but shifting from trunk to keep a consistent relationship to their movement, as if maintaining line of sight mattered. The distance remained nearly the same. The men later agreed that it felt like being measured. Like something was learning their pace, their caution, the way they moved together. By the time they reached thicker cover, it was no longer visible. But the sensation did not leave with the sight. They returned to camp with the kind of careful calm that signals trouble. They did not burst in shouting. They simply took their places closer to the fire and spoke less. That night the watches extended, and no one laughed at the older term when it was finally repeated. The word was said not as a story now, but as a practical summary, a way to compress what could not be comfortably described. And once it had been seen moving, the hunters began to understand that the earlier disturbances were not random. They were the perimeter of something that had been nearby for some time and was now choosing to step closer. In the days after the sighting, nothing dramatic happened, which is precisely what made the situation degrade. The hunters did not experience a single night of attack that could be pointed to later as the moment everything changed. Instead, they experienced repetition. The figure appeared again, not in the same place, but in the same manner, at the edge of a clearing, or between trunks at a distance that forced the eye to work. Sometimes it was seen at dawn, sometimes at dusk, sometimes in that middle light under cloud where the forest looks washed and depth becomes uncertain. Always it kept a distance. Always it was upright. Always it behaved as though it understood their line of sight and preferred to remain within it, but not inside it. Hunters are used to the feeling of being watched by animals, but animal watching is cautious and opportunistic. This watching felt neutral, almost administrative. Men described it as being paced, not stalked. A stalk has intention. A pace has patience. There were moments when a man would glance to his left and see nothing, and then glance again and see it, in the same place a trunk had been a moment before, as if it had shifted during the blink or during the instant his attention moved elsewhere. That detail in the reports is described without drama. The men did not claim impossibility. They described how quickly it could reposition without drawing attention to the motion itself. It made them distrust their own perception, not because they thought they were hallucinating, but because they realized the figure understood how to move without being fully tracked. The most consistent description is the lack of sound. Deer can move quietly, but even they break twigs sometimes. A man cannot help making some noise when stepping. This thing, as described, seemed to move without announcing itself. The hunters would hear their own equipment, the slight clink of metal, the drag of leather, but from the figure there was nothing. Silence around it felt thicker. Not supernatural, simply as if the environment refused to amplify its presence. They attempted ordinary countermeasures. They changed routes unpredictably, doubled back, used ridge lines to break line of sight. They placed themselves where the wind would carry scent away, as if dealing with a predator. None of it changed the pattern. If they moved east, it was seen to the east later. If they withdrew toward open ground, it appeared at the tree line, still maintaining that same careful distance. It did not seem to be forced to follow their paths. It seemed to anticipate where they would reappear. The pressure of this kind of pursuit is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. A chase is clear. You run, you hide, you survive. This was a long, slow contact that made every movement feel like part of a conversation you did not consent to. The hunters began to feel that simply being out there was participation. Some began to refuse to go. Not dramatically, not with declarations, but with sudden injuries, with claims of illness, with excuses that would have sounded weak a month earlier. It also affected how they spoke. In the reports, men begin to use the language of proximity rather than identity. They say it was there again. It kept with us. It stayed to the left. They avoid adjectives, as if adjectives risk turning it into something too solid. Yet their descriptions of their own behavior betray the change. They stop separating even for simple tasks. A man would not step away to relieve himself without another man turning his body to keep watch. They began to carry extra torches not to see better, but to make their presence larger. The figure never approached directly in these days, and that restraint became part of the dread. If it had attacked, there would have been an outcome. Instead, it sustained the uncertainty. It taught them that it could remain near without consequence, and that their usual boundaries did not apply. In normal hunting, distance is control. If you can see something at 200 yards, you have time. Here, distance became meaningless, because it was maintained by the thing itself. It could have closed it, but chose not to, and that choice implied intention. By late summer, the hunters began to act as though they were under observation, even when they could not see anything. That is a notable change. It is one thing to respond to a visible threat. It is another to alter your life because of the possibility of being watched. That alteration is the kind of slow harm that does not leave bruises, but leaves habits. They were no longer only hunting. They were managing their exposure, trying not to be noticed, while carrying the growing suspicion that they already had been. The rules emerged in the way survival rules often do, through quiet trial and error. Nobody wrote them down. Nobody stood before the group and declared them. Yet within a few weeks, the hunters were following the same restrictions as if they had agreed in advance. The first was simple: no hunting after dusk. Not because the men suddenly feared night as an abstract, but because the sightings clustered in the uncertain hours when light thinned and the forest edges grew ambiguous. Daylight was not protection, but it gave them clarity, and clarity felt like the only advantage left. They began returning earlier, sometimes leaving good sign untouched, because pursuing it would mean being in the woods at the wrong hour. The second rule was also practical: no solitary tracking. Where once a man might split off for a short time to follow a promising trail, now they stayed close enough to hear each other's footsteps. They began speaking in low, functional phrases, not to comfort each other, but to confirm presence. A voice at your shoulder is proof that you are still inside the human world. Camps were repositioned. They chose open ground where possible, even if it meant less shelter from wind. They stopped camping deep under thick branches where the night could press close. Fires were kept steady but controlled, not large enough to attract attention from far away, but not so low that the darkness became complete. The hunters began to understand that the fire did not keep something out. It simply allowed them to see each other, to read faces, to measure time. Silence was enforced during watches. This seems contradictory since voices had become proof of presence, but the men learned that too much sound felt like broadcasting. So they spoke only when necessary, and when they did, it was close, almost whispered. They stopped whistling, they stopped singing. A few reports mention a younger hunter humming out of habit and being cut off sharply, not by anger, but by a kind of immediate urgency that suggested the rule was not social, but defensive. They also developed a habit of not looking directly into certain stands of timber at night. This is perhaps the most psychologically revealing rule, because it is not rational in the way the others are. It is based on the fear that attention itself matters. Men would keep their eyes moving across open ground, scanning for movement, but when their gaze reached the darker clusters of trees, they would slide past them, as if looking too hard might invite something to look back. Another rule formed around carcasses: do not approach, do not touch. Do not bring them to camp. In earlier years, any found game could be salvaged. Now they left it, even if it meant hunger. The choice tells you how deeply the wrongness had entered their calculations. When men who depend on meat begin to refuse meat, something fundamental has shifted. These rules did not make them feel safe, but they made them feel less exposed. They created a structure within the uncertainty. Structure is what the human mind reaches for when it cannot understand. The danger is that structure can also become ritual, and ritual can make people feel they have control when they do not. In 1875, the rules held for a while, not because they solved the problem, but because the thing they were avoiding continued to behave as it had, keeping distance, sustaining the pacing, remaining at the edge. That is why the breaking point is so clearly remembered. When people live under a quiet threat, they begin to believe their precautions are working. They begin to attribute the absence of catastrophe to their own discipline. And when that belief forms, the moment it is disproven carries a particular shock. The night the distance collapsed did not begin with a scream or a fight. It began with the same rules being followed carefully, and the realization, arriving slowly and then all at once, that the rules no longer mattered. It happened on a night when they had done everything according to the new discipline. They had returned early, chosen open ground near a low rise, and built a controlled fire. 3 men were present, experienced enough to handle a difficult night without spiraling into panic. They ate quietly and checked equipment with a methodical care that suggests they were trying to keep their minds inside ordinary work. They set the watches. They kept their voices low. They did not wander. The first hours passed with a kind of tense calm that had become normal. Wind moved across the grass. The fire settled. One man on watch noted that the forest edge remained too quiet, but that, too, had become a familiar condition. The second watch began after midnight, when fatigue makes perception unreliable. It is in that phase that the mind starts to create shapes from shadow, and the men knew it. They had trained themselves not to overreact. That training, ironically, is what allowed the threat to come closer before they acknowledged it. The watcher reported a sense of pressure first, the feeling of being observed from a particular direction. He did not see anything at once. He simply felt his body orienting toward the tree line on the north side of the clearing. He listened. He heard nothing distinct. Then he noticed, and this appears in more than one account, that the sound of the fire changed. Not louder or quieter, but as if the air around it had thickened, as if the crackle did not carry as far. He woke the others not by shouting, but by a hand on a shoulder, by the kind of physical signal used when you do not want to project sound. The 3 men sat up, alert and silent. They looked in the same direction without discussing it. And then, at the edge of the trees, closer than before, the pale figure was visible. This time it was not a distant shape between trunks. It was near enough that they could see the outline of shoulders and limbs with clarity. It stood partly in shadow, but the pallor of it separated it from the dark. They could see that it was thin but not starving in a human way. Its limbs were long, the proportions slightly extended, as if made for reaching rather than running. The arms hung with a kind of slackness, but the hands, when visible, seemed held in a half-curled posture, not relaxed, not clenched, simply poised. The face was described in restrained terms. A flatness to it, a lack of expression, eyes that did not catch light the way eyes usually do at night, which made it difficult to know where it was looking, and that uncertainty was part of the strain. One man wrote that he could not tell if it was watching them or watching through them, as though sight were not its only method. Another noted the stillness of the mouth, not open in threat, not moving in breath, though they later became aware of a sound that might have been breathing. That sound is important because it was the first time they heard it. It was not a growl, not speech. It was a slow intake and release, faint but steady, like air moving through a narrow passage. It did not come with the visible rise and fall of a chest. It seemed detached from the body, as though the sound belonged to the space around it rather than to its lungs. The men listened to it the way you listen to something you cannot locate precisely, and the act of listening made them feel more exposed. They did not fire. Again, later readers have questioned this, but the accounts make clear that the men were not paralyzed by awe. They were calculating, and their calculation kept returning to the same problem. If they shot and it fell, they would have to approach to confirm. If they shot and it did not fall, they would have announced weakness. The rifles were held ready, but the men waited for a moment that made action make sense. That moment did not come. Instead, the figure did something small that collapsed their remaining confidence. It stepped forward out of the tree line and into the open, not rushing, not crouching, simply moving with the same deliberate control they had already seen at distance. The boundary they had relied on, the assumed barrier between forest and clearing, became meaningless. It did not hesitate at the open ground as an animal might. It did not avoid the firelight. It entered the clearing's edge and stopped again, closer than any previous sighting, close enough that the men could see the texture of the skin as uniform and dull, close enough that the wrongness of proportion could no longer be attributed to illusion. In that moment, the hunters experienced something that reads in the statements as physical rather than emotional. Their mouths went dry, their fingers stiffened. One man wrote that his thoughts narrowed to a single task, to keep his body from making sudden movement. Fear in those accounts is not described as screaming. It is described as control under strain, like holding a heavy weight in an extended position. You can do it for a time, but you know it will fail eventually. The figure remained still for a long interval. No one measured it, but the writing suggests it was long enough to feel like intention. Long enough for the men to wonder whether it was waiting for something from them. Long enough for their eyes to water from staring without blinking. Long enough that one man's arm began to tremble under the rifle's weight, and he had to lower it slightly, which felt to him like a surrender. Then, without warning in the ordinary sense, it moved again, not toward them directly, but along the edge of the clearing, circling in a way that kept its distance from the fire, but reduced the distance from the men. It was not a predator's circle, not an attempt to flank for attack. It was a slow repositioning that placed it closer to the men's side, nearer to where the darkness was thicker. The men turned with it, trying to keep it in front of them, and in doing so realized how easily it could manage their attention, how it could make them pivot and expose their backs to other angles. That was when they made the decision to retreat, not run into the forest, but withdraw away from it, toward the open ground behind camp. They backed away in step, keeping the fire between themselves and the figure as long as possible. The figure did not charge. It did not retreat. It simply remained close enough to confirm that it could collapse distance whenever it chose. The men later described, with a particular calm horror, that it felt as if the earlier pacing had been a kind of preparation, and that tonight was the first time it had decided to demonstrate control. They left the camp as it was, some supplies abandoned, because stopping to pack would have required bending, looking down, turning away. They moved until the first gray of morning thinned the shadows. Only when they were far from that clearing did their breathing change, becoming shallow and rapid, as if their bodies had delayed the panic until their minds permitted it. They did not speak much afterward. They did not need to. The rules had been proven insufficient. Whatever the Strigoi was, it was no longer content to remain at the edge. The abandonment that followed was not announced. There was no public declaration that the hunting grounds were cursed. The change showed itself in absence. Trails that had been used for generations went untrodden. Stands of timber that had always provided game were simply not entered. Men found other work. They trapped smaller animals closer to home. They accepted hunger that would have been considered shameful in earlier years. The loss of resource was treated as a quiet cost, the way you accept that a certain bridge is out and you must take the longer road. In the district notes, you can see the effect indirectly. There are fewer hides recorded from certain valleys. There are gaps in the usual trade. Complaints about scarcity rise, but no one writes the reason plainly. When the Strigoi is mentioned, it is in the same restrained, functional way it first appeared, as an explanation offered only when no other explanation suffices. It becomes the shorthand for a decision that people do not want to justify in public. We do not go there now. Why? Because of it. What is notable is what they did not do. They did not organize a hunt for it. They did not bring priests into the forest. They did not form parties with torches and dogs. The older hunters discouraged those ideas when they surfaced. Not because they lacked courage, but because the phenomenon had taught them something about the nature of the encounter. It did not behave like a predator that could be cornered. It did not respond to intimidation. It did not reveal itself in ways that allowed planning, and it had already shown that it could close distance without effort. Confrontation would not be a contest of skill. it would be an act of exposure. So the region adapted. People spoke less about the deeper woods. Children were warned away with ordinary language. Do not go far. Do not take the shortcut. Do not play near that creek. The warnings did not include monsters. They included consequences. You will get lost. You will fall. You will freeze. Adults do this when they cannot bring themselves to describe the true reason, and yet still need the behavior to change. The shape of fear becomes disguised as prudence. For a time, the strategy seemed to work. The sightings became less common, or perhaps simply less reported. When people stop going to a place, they stop collecting evidence from it. Silence grows, and it is easy to mistake silence for safety. But those who had been closest to it did not speak as though the problem had ended. They spoke as though they had withdrawn from an agreement they never wanted. They had been noticed, and then they had removed themselves from the area of attention, hoping that distance would make them irrelevant again. Years later, when the old men were asked what happened in 1875, they did not tell elaborate stories. They said the hunting failed. They said the forest was wrong. They said they left. The simplicity of the account is, in its own way, an admission. There was nothing they could do that would make sense of it. There was only the decision to stop offering themselves to it and to accept the economic and personal cost of that decision. What lingers in the record is not the image of the figure itself, but the aftermath, the way the land remained ordinary while the human relationship to it changed permanently. The trees did not wither. The river did not dry up. The deer eventually returned to some of the lower valleys. Seasons continued. The forest did what forests do. And yet the hunters did not return to certain places, not because they believed the ground was cursed, but because their bodies had learned a lesson that their minds could not fully articulate. In later recollections, the men describe a particular kind of discomfort when they passed near the old trails, even in daylight, even in groups. Not a panic, but a tightening, a fixation. They would find themselves listening harder than necessary, scanning the tree line in a way that had once been reserved for wolves. It was as if the experience had installed a new sense, one that did not turn off when the immediate threat was absent. That is a common consequence of prolonged contact with something you cannot predict. The mind becomes trained to look for repetition, for pattern, for the return of the same wrongness. They also emphasize repeatedly what did not happen. They never killed it. They never drove it off. They never proved what it was. The Strigoi did not end with a confrontation that could be folded into a satisfying narrative. It simply receded into the background of their decisions, like a boundary that could not be crossed. When asked directly whether it was truly a Strigoi, some men answered in the only honest way available. They said, "That is the word we had for it. That is what the old ones called that kind of thing. It does not mean we understood it." One of the last notes in the clerk's hand, written years after the initial statement, includes a line that reads like a tired conclusion rather than a warning. He wrote that the hunting grounds had been left because the men believed the presence remained. Not active, not raging, simply present. He did not add explanation. He did not attach a moral. He recorded it the way you record that a bridge remains unsafe. The final reflection that emerges from these accounts is quiet and unsettling for its practicality. The men came to believe that being noticed was the central danger, more than being attacked. They behaved as if the attention itself carried risk, as if once you were measured by it, you became part of its environment. They did not speak of it feeding. They did not speak of it killing for hunger. The bodies were evidence of killing, yes, but the manner did not resemble ordinary predation. The pacing did not resemble hunting. The closeness on that final night did not resemble a strike. It resembled a test. That is why the story ends without resolution. It does not offer the comfort of victory. It offers only the record of withdrawal, the acknowledgement that some forms of threat do not need to announce themselves with violence to change a community. In 1875, a group of experienced hunters adjusted their lives around something they could not name without old language, something they could not confront without exposing themselves to a kind of attention they did not understand. The land remained, but their permission to move freely through it did not. And the most honest closing thought in the surviving statements is the simplest one. Some predators do not hunt to feed. Some remain near because proximity is the point.